Hey there, this is Matt, and I think it's time for a desk and studio tour. Now, I usually do videos about running AI models locally on your hardware, but folks have been asking for a while how I make my videos, especially how I make them sound so good. And I would say there are a few specific tools that help me achieve this. This week was a hard one, with a conference that I went to, as well as appearing on Devops and Docker Talk with Brett Fisher. I just wanted something easy this week, and this I thought would be easier than it turned out to be. Now, I'm not going to show the entire process that I use, but if you're interested, I can go into more detail on some portions of it. Maybe a more in-depth version might make it into my Patreon, which, by the way, I just set up and can be found at patreon.com/technoevangelist. Now, there are a bunch of ways we can talk about the studio and my process. Studio. But it's important to note that this is my process. I've been making videos for myself and for my employers for almost 2 decades. So I have a lot of stuff, but all you really need is an idea and a phone, assuming it has a decent camera. Let's start with the room. This is it. It's about 6.5 feet wide by about 14 feet long and about 7 feet tall. It's kinda tight. It shows up on the plans as storage space, but it works really well for me. There's another room that might be better, but that's where my daughter sleeps for now. And being inside the house means being closer to the screaming of Stella when she's with her gaggle of 5-year-old friends. On the other side of this wall is the rest of the garage, and there's storage directly above me. So it might move up and out in the next few months if we redo the walls. Now, if you've paid attention to my videos, you might have also seen our main hallway, parts of our kitchen, and part of the backyard, but mostly these videos are done from this office. The next thing that folks usually look at in these videos is the desk, or desks, because there's actually 2 of them in here. The older one is where the actual studio is because I spend less time there. It's the desk I bought maybe 10 years ago or so, and it's terrible. But there wasn't a lot of choice back then. It comes from a company called NextDesk, which is also sold under the name Xdesk and a bunch of other brands. This one is called the Terra, but they are all terrible. Pretty much on par with most of the cheap, wobbly sit-stand desks using the same cheap Chinese legs like Fully and Uplift and so many others. Now, I am not saying that Chinese means low end, but these legs happen to be cheap and low quality. Give it a decent shove, and it wobbles so much. I see so many video reviews online, and they talk about how stable the desk is, as it visibly wobbles back and forth. Xdesk, Fully, Uplift, they may be assembled in the US, but they start with garbage parts, and they're all consistently bad. On the other side of the room, I have a desk from Desk House out of Holland, Michigan. I can't say enough good things about Desk House. Their desks are only a few dollars more than most of the cheap garbage out there, and yet are so much more stable. I can push hard on here, and there is barely any budging going on. We have another of their desks upstairs in our bedroom, and both are rock solid, even more solid than most fixed height desks. Sometime soon, we're probably going to replace that NextDesk desk with another smaller Desk House desk. The downside to Desk House is that the company is small. Last I saw, they were 3 to 5 people. Maybe it's more now. So delivery can take a few weeks. Okay, let's move on to how I capture the video. This has changed a lot in the last 6 months to a simpler yet a little bit harder process. I just record to the SD card on the camera and then move that card from the camera to the editing computer. The camera is a Panasonic S5 IIX with a 24mm f1.8 lens. I haven't seen anything that approaches this in the $2,000 to $4,000 range in terms of quality and features. It replaced the GH5 that I had for a bunch of years, and the one thing I missed from that is the ability to do slow motion at 240 frames per second, and I didn't do that all that much. I also have an ATEM Mini Extreme ISO, which has 8 HDMI inputs, 2 audio inputs, 2 HDMI outputs, and 2 USB-C outputs. I used to record from the GH5 to the ATEM because even though the GH5 had a higher resolution, I didn't have much reason to use it. The ATEM will record all 8 HDMI inputs plus the program out plus both audio inputs to 11 different files on an SSD attached to one of the USB-C ports. That's pretty cool. And it has an Ethernet port, so it shows up on the network using FTP. That meant I could have a macro that I triggered from the Streamdeck that would collect the name of the video using Keyboard Maestro, then set that to the name on the ATEM, then start recording, and when done, start an FTP transfer to my editing MacBook Pro. And by the time I was ready to start editing, the files were already there on the machine. And that was awesome. If there's a downside to the S5 IIX, that it supports a much higher resolution. In fact, it's just about 6,000 by 4,000 pixels. I record at 10-bit and 24 frames per second in Vlog. The reason I record at that resolution is that I tend to record the full video and then different content for 5 to 10 shorts for each video. On YouTube, those shorts tend to be 1080 by 1920, so vertical format. So I can play a lot with the framing and even zoom in a lot. But that's far bigger than what the ATEM supports, so I can't use that workflow anymore. I even looked into using the other Blackmagic recorders and the Atomos recorder, but nothing supports that resolution from the S5 IIX. So now, when I'm done, I have to power down the camera and pull out the SD card and move it over to my editing bay manually. I still have an SSD attached to the ATEMs as it's sometimes really convenient for working with screen recordings. The other USB-C port goes to my recording Mac, which is an M1 Mac Mini with 8 gigs of RAM. It was the cheapest M1 Mac Mini you could get when it first came out. I use this to control the ATEM and my audio interface, and to run Arc, which is my browser, to access my teleprompter software and StreamYard. And I also use it to run Audio Hijack. And then the 2 HDMI outputs go to my 2 monitors. Now, I'm going to mention one of those, both of those in a sec. So just in front of the camera is a teleprompter. I have had a number of teleprompters over the years, but I still actually use the first one I ever bought. It's the pad prompter from One Take Only. I'm not sure when exactly I bought this, but I feel like it was about 12 to 15 years ago. It was designed for the 9-inch iPads. I eventually replaced the iPad for a Lilliput 10-inch monitor that I got about 4 years ago. One of the benefits of that monitor is that it reverses the text so that it appears correctly in the mirror. I duct taped it into the prompter, and it works great. I just wish it were a little larger, but I have some plans for that. The teleprompter is hooked up as an output from the ATEM, and I usually set that to the Mac Mini, though with these buttons on the Streamdeck, I can set it and the main monitor to the camera or whatever I have hooked up on the desktop. So on the Mac, I usually have Speakflow loaded up in my browser. Now, Speakflow is an amazing teleprompting application that recognizes what you say and scrolls automatically. There is also an iPad app that promises this feature, but it doesn't work more often than it does. I find myself repeating sections over and over, hoping it will scroll, but it doesn't. At first, I didn't know why I would pay for the subscription to Speakflow, but 8 months in, and I am so glad I have it. I'm on the Plus plan, but the basic plan looks like the best option for most folks. If you're doing this for work, expense it, like I did. The last part of the video capture process is the lights. I use 2 Elgato Keylights, which I've had for about 7 or 8 years. They are amazing. My favorite part is that they appear on the network with a RESTful endpoint, so I can control them straight from the Streamdeck or any other tool. Elgato is a hardware company first. and I do everything I can to avoid using any of their software because it's awful. There are so many complaints about these lights, but they are really complaining mostly about the iPhone app to control them. But you don't need to use the phone app ever. I also have some lights from Amaran, but they require you to use the dumpster fire known as Citus Link. They refuse to open it up to software developers, so you are stuck using their tools. Elgato's tools suck too, but the folks there seem to know it and are open to their customers using other software controllers instead. And so the Amaran lights just gather dust in the garage, and I buy more and more Elgato stuff every chance I have. I haven't found any other lights that are as useful and flexible for so little money as the Elgato Keylights. At double the price, they would still be a bargain compared to anything else out there. Okay, so now let's talk about audio. Most videos in the last few months have audio from this microphone. It's from a Russian company called Octava, and it's the MK12. I've had mine for about 4 years or so, and it goes for about $300. It's interesting because it has one mic preamp with different pattern capsules that screw in on the front. I use the hypercardioid capsule. It sounds great and easily competes with microphones at double the cost. It's beautifully made and comes in a lovely wooden box. The other microphone I used to use all the time but hasn't gotten much love more recently is the Heil PR40. I bought this maybe 15 to 20 years ago from a shop at the southernmost edge of the Netherlands. It was the only place in the country that sold it, and they didn't do anything online. So I drove down from my home in Amsterdam. It was the cool mic to get at the time, and I definitely don't regret it. It sounds incredible, and I've done so many voiceovers with it over the years. I started using it again when I was co-hosting Devops and Docker Talk with Brett Fisher, but eventually got tired of always having it in the frame. Both mics are mounted to 2 different mic arms from Elgato. These mic arms are so great and so much cheaper than anything out there of similar quality. You probably need to go to Yellowtech for better arms, but that's going to cost a lot more. These are so much better than the PS1 from Rode. In fact, my PS1 is rotting in the garage somewhere. The mics are connected to an audio interface from Universal Audio called the Apollo Twin X Quad. I got this about 3 years ago, replacing an older, cheap interface I used before because they didn't support a newer Mac OS. I've gone through a few different interfaces from Connect Audio and M Audio and Apogee, and I have to say the Apollo is my favorite. At about $1,300 or so, it wasn't cheap, but it's worked out well. It has an ability to load up plugins directly on the hardware itself for lower latency. This has been magic for streams. I'll go ahead and turn off all the plugins, and you can hear what they sound like. So off, off, and off. So this is the raw sound from the Apollo, and it already sounds pretty good, as is. The first plugin, which I'm turning on right now, is a channel strip called the Avalon VT737 SP. The hardware it's based on includes a tube preamp, opto compressor, and EQ. I played around with a lot of alternatives, but really like the sound of this one for me. Maybe someday I can afford the $3,500 for the real thing, though I understand the software version is a really good likeness of the original. Next comes the Oxford suppressor, which I am turning on right now. I knew I needed a de-esser, but I had a hard time using them. This plugin made it easier to find the right configuration for me. Finally, there's the AMS Neve DFC, which I just turned on. This is the final cleaner-upper. If there was a noisy truck outside, you wouldn't hear it anymore. And the water heater in the garage just goes away. Even the garage door opening and closing is quiet with this. It's kind of magic and super easy to use. The output from the Apollo goes to one of the inputs on the ATEM, and then one of the outputs from there goes to the Mac Mini, where I record the audio in Audio Hijack from Rogue Amoeba. One of the other uses for Audio Hijack is dialing in the settings for all my plugins. You can throw different blocks into a chain in the software, and one of the blocks is a delay. I set that to 3 to 10 seconds and say something, and then play with the settings again. It's not perfect, but I don't have the magic ability to listen to myself as I'm talking and tweak the settings live. I guess the alternative would be to have one of my friends come by and tweak the settings for me. Heck, I live in a place where members of bands you may know actually live. But it's easier for me to stay in my hole by myself. There's one more supercritical item in here to help get great sound, and they are all around me. There are 7 244 bass traps from GIK Acoustics. The ones on the ceiling are 2 by 4 feet, and the ones on the walls are 2 by 3 and have a few of my photos printed on them. We have the Zakim Bridge in Boston, where I met my wife and where we adopted our daughter. The lighthouse at Billbag State Park on Key Biscayne, Florida, where I grew up. Over by the camera is a picture of a jellyfish at the aquarium at Monterey Bay. Interesting side note, the architect used for some of that aquarium also built this house. I think it's his retirement project. Next is a building near the General Motors HQ in Detroit, and that's my niece on her scooter. And finally, there's a staircase at the Bainbridge Island Museum of Art, and I live on Bainbridge Island near Seattle. There are plenty of DIY versions of these sound panels, but I'd much rather get them done right, and they look incredible. And 2 years later, I barely even feel the $1,400 they cost me. I've mentioned this a few times already, but everything is controlled with the Streamdeck XL from Elgato. I don't use their software because it's terrible. Instead, I use Companion from Bitfocus. This is a lot more flexible with integrations for hundreds of devices. For historical reasons, I have this hooked up to a Raspberry Pi that's also running PlayOutB, which is a HyperDeck clone. I'll probably eventually move Companion to the Mac Mini, where it makes more sense in this setup. So I think that's the recording side in its entirety. When recording's done, I grab the SD card from the camera, and then in Audio Hijack, I rename the file and then choose to send it over AirDrop to my MacBook on the other desk. Hazel on the MacBook Pro then copies that to a specific folder and feeds it through some software called Levelator, which is the only post-processing I do on any audio in my videos. And then that file and the video recording from the S5 IIX are added to a new library in Final Cut Pro, and I merge them all into one file before adding to the timeline. I've never had any issues with doing that. Looking over at that desk, the biggest, most obvious thing there is the monitor. This is the LG 40W P95C-W 40-inch curved ultrawide that has a 5120 by 2160 resolution. It is gorgeous to look at and a joy to use all the time. It works beautifully with the Mac and is the first monitor I've tried that I actually like to use more than the MacBook's own monitor. I love seeing the full timeline go all the way across the monitor, but sometimes I have VS Code at a decent size and Final Cut still has a long space for the timeline. On either side is a pair of IK Multimedia iLoud MTM Studio monitors, which are connected to the MacBook Pro via an old Connect Audio 2.4 audio interface. That device was pretty unique when it came out because it requires no drivers to use. On the desk, you can see a few keyboards. The main one is the Voyager from ZSA, which I think could be the most perfect keyboard ever made. Some folks are going to complain about the dust between the keys, but I prefer to worry about more important things, and dust on a keyboard is normal and not worth worrying about. I don't know, those people probably clean their laptop screen more than, once every 3 to 6 months that's actually needed. Back by the monitor is the previous holder of that title of Best Keyboard Ever, the Plank, also from ZSA, unfortunately discontinued. I use that when working in a tool called Audio Design Desk because it can't seem to handle remap keyboards. Between the two is a Creator Micro from Work Louder that I use when editing videos with Final Cut Pro. Every key on there represents the most used functions in Final Cut for me and speeds up the edit so much. And finally, there's the original Stream Deck right by the Voyager. And so that's the room and the equipment, the software, and some of my workflow. Hopefully that answers the questions that regularly come in on the topic. If you want more of these types of tangents, some of them might make it to this channel, but more will show up on my website, which I'm working on updating right now at technoevangelist.com. And you can also sign up for my newsletter there at technoevangelist.com/newsletter. I'm trying to put out one each month around the first of the month, with the first of them coming up really, really soon. So sign up and let me know what you think. Finally, I have been so humbled and excited when folks left tips in the comments. They're definitely not expected, but so much appreciated. I didn't even know that was possible. Well, for those folks who have been begging me to set something up, there's now a Patreon at patreon.com/technoevangelist. I feel kind of weird setting that up and sharing it, but there it is. That'll help cover my Patreons for the Final Cut Bro, the Create Unknown, and the Bloke. Almost everything I mentioned in the video is listed below in the description. Some have affiliate links, which is just a nice few extra pennies for me at no cost to you. Thanks so much for being here. 20 or so minutes into this video. Back to the regular stuff next time. Goodbye. It's the Pat Wesley mug again. Not cold yet, despite 20 minutes.